I never thought a single morning could change everything. It started like any other. My husband left for his weekend business trip, and I was left alone with my stepson. He was supposed to go with his dad, but for some reason, I asked him to stay. I don't know why, but when I looked at him, something inside me twisted. The request felt almost desperate. And I knew deep down this wasn't a normal weekend. It wasn't going to be a normal day. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, like a storm was coming. I was making coffee in the kitchen, trying to fill the space with the normal sounds of the morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. I glanced over at him, sitting at the table, his homework spread out in front of him, but his mind clearly miles away. I asked him for the coffee, nothing unusual, but when he handed me the cup, my fingers lingered on his hand longer than necessary. It wasn't intentional at first, but then I realized what I was doing, and for some reason I didn't pull away. His eyes met mine, and I felt a sharp pang in my chest. It wasn't just a glance, it was something more. It was almost like a challenge, or maybe an invitation. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice softer than it should have been. Something in me hesitated, like I was testing the waters, seeing if he could feel the same weight in the air that I did. He looked at me, confused and a little uncomfortable. About what? I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that you feel this pull, this shift between you, without sounding insane? Instead, I said the first thing that came to my mind. About us. You're not a kid anymore, and things feel different between us. Have you noticed? His eyebrows furrowed, and I could tell he didn't understand. He was trying to brush it off, trying to act like everything was fine, but I could see the tension in his face, the way he shifted in his chair, the way his gaze kept darting away from mine. "Margot, I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered, trying to laugh it off, but his smile was weak. I wasn't convinced. Something inside me, something I couldn't explain, told me that he was feeling it too. The same pull, the same confusion, but I didn't let him off the hook. "You don't feel it?" I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "The way everything's changed?" There it was, the moment of truth. The air was thick, and neither of us could ignore it anymore. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. He didn't respond right away, just looked away. I knew he didn't have the words to say what we both felt, and I couldn't stop myself from pushing further. "It's just us here today," I said, moving closer to him, trying to lower the space between us. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending." He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. His hand still in mine, his eyes avoiding mine, he just sat there, frozen, caught between something he didn't want to admit and something we couldn't deny. The conversation didn't go anywhere. We both just sat there, lost in the quiet hum of the house, the weight of the words unspoken hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Neither of us had said what we really meant, but we both knew that something had shifted. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the same way I felt it crawling under my skin. It was too hard to ignore now. I was too far gone, and I knew he was too. As the day went on, I tried to focus on the mundane things, making lunch, cleaning up, pretending like everything was normal. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. Every time I looked at him, it was there. The tension, the space between us that wasn't quite right anymore. I could feel my heart beating faster when he walked into the room, and it was hard to look away when our eyes met. That evening, we ended up sitting by the fireplace. The rain outside hit the windows like 1,000 tiny drums, and the house felt warmer, more intimate somehow. The kind of quiet that would usually be comforting, but now it only amplified everything I was trying to ignore. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but I wasn't reading. Not really. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me from the corner of my eye. I couldn't figure out if he was just as lost in his thoughts as I was, or if something else was happening between us. I wanted to say something, to break the silence, to make sense of what was happening. But I couldn't find the words. How do you explain this? How do you even begin to talk about the impossible, about the feelings you can't control, no matter how much you try to push them away? Do you ever think about how things used to be? I asked, breaking the silence. Not really sure where the question came from, but it felt right somehow. He shrugged, glancing at me before looking back at the fire. "Yes, sometimes," he said. "It's hard not to, with everything that's happened. This place, it's always been home, you know?" I nodded, my chest tightening. "I remember when you were little, running up and down these stairs. Your dad and I would be sitting here, and you'd talk for hours about the most random stuff. I used to think that nothing would ever change." His eyes flickered for a second, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I remember that." We both fell silent again. It was like we were both stuck in the past, trying to remember a time when everything was simple, when things didn't feel so complicated. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed some invisible line, that whatever it was between us now, it couldn't be undone. The connection, the pull, it was real. I looked at him, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I think about it sometimes, what it would be like if things stayed the way they were." The words felt like a confession, like something I should have kept inside, but I couldn't anymore. He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes I think I'd rather keep things like this," he said softly. "Not that I know what this even is." I wanted to answer, to tell him that I didn't know either, but I couldn't. Instead, I just nodded, unsure of where this was going. But I felt it in the pit of my stomach. Whatever it was between us, it wasn't going away. It was only getting stronger. The rain was still coming down hard outside, the fire crackling in the background, but all I could focus on was the growing distance between the person I used to be and the one I was becoming. And somehow, that distance seemed to bring us closer. The next morning came like a quiet echo, the sunlight creeping through the blinds and settling on the floor in soft patches. Everything looked normal, but it felt anything but. I was exhausted, not physically, but mentally. The tension from the night before hung between us like a heavy cloud that wouldn't lift. I tried to pretend it wasn't there, tried to go through the motions like I always had, but it was impossible. We ate breakfast together, the silence thick, filled only by the clink of silverware. I watched him, noticing little things I hadn't before. The way his hands moved, the way his eyes lingered just a bit too long on mine when he thought I wasn't looking. I felt my heart rate pick up every time our gazes met, but he didn't say anything. Neither of us did. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that everything between us was changing, and it terrified me. I tried to reason with myself. He was my stepson. Nothing could ever happen. But what if it already had? What if I was already too far gone? Later, we ended up back by the fireplace. The house was quiet again, the rain outside now just a light drizzle. I felt restless, like I couldn't sit still. It was too much to ignore anymore, the pull between us. It was there in every glance, every word left unsaid. The thought of pulling away from him, of putting space between us, felt impossible now. "Do you ever think about boundaries?" I asked, my voice shaky, betraying how conflicted I felt. About how we should keep things separate? I couldn't believe I was saying it out loud, but it was the only way to make sense of the mess in my head. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then finally he spoke. "Sometimes. But then the idea of not seeing you at all, that scares me." The words hit me harder than I expected. It was exactly how I felt, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I swallowed hard. "I know," I whispered. "It scares me too." The room felt suffocating, the space between us closing in. I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that this was all okay. Every word, every movement, every shared moment felt like we were both teetering on the edge of something we couldn't stop, no matter how hard we tried. And then, without thinking, I reached out and touched his hand. It wasn't a calculated move, but it was enough to send a jolt through both of us. The instant my skin touched his, everything changed. I could see the shock in his eyes, and I knew he was feeling it too. The weight of the moment, the pull, the connection, it was undeniable. But we didn't speak. We just sat there, our hands still touching, the silence between us more deafening than ever. It wasn't right. I knew that, but it felt real, too real to deny anymore. As the rain stopped, I realized that things would never go back to how they were. This was our new reality now, and it was impossible to ignore. That evening, the house felt even quieter than before. The world outside had settled into a muted calm, the rain finally stopping, leaving the air crisp and heavy. It was as if the weather itself had mirrored everything inside me. Everything that was building up, pressing against the walls I'd so carefully built over the years. But those walls were crumbling, piece by piece, and I couldn't stop it anymore. I had always prided myself on being in control, but sitting across from him, his eyes locked on mine, the feeling of him in the same space as me was overwhelming. I knew I should have pulled away, made an excuse to leave the room, to separate myself from the situation. But I couldn't. Every part of me was drawn to him, like something magnetic that couldn't be resisted. We sat in the dim light of the living room, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. He was close enough that I could hear his quiet breathing, and with every second that passed, the air between us grew thicker. The tension was palpable, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for the other to make the next move. "Do you ever think this is all wrong?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I was asking him, but I was asking myself too. I needed to know if he felt as torn as I did, if he understood how dangerous this was. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I could see the confusion, the struggle in them. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. I could feel the shift, the way he was fighting it, the same way I had been. He leaned forward slightly, the space between us closing even more. And then, it happened. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something either of us consciously decided. But suddenly, we were closer. I could feel his warmth against me. I could see the turmoil in his eyes. It was all so fast, too fast, and yet it felt like it had been building forever. The pull between us, the gravity of it, couldn't be denied any longer. He reached out, his fingers brushing my arm, and it felt like everything in my body went still, frozen in that moment. My heart raced, my mind screamed to pull away, to stop this before it went too far. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be stopped now. For just a second, everything felt quiet again. No words, no movements, just the two of us, caught in the aftermath of something that was impossible to ignore. And then, somehow, the distance between us vanished. We both knew what was happening, and yet we didn't stop it. It was strange. It was wrong. But for that moment, it felt undeniable. And we both knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. The walls I'd spent so long building were gone, and I couldn't even bring myself to care. It was too late. Days passed, and everything felt like it was moving in slow motion, like the world outside the walls of this house was moving on without us. I kept wondering if it was all just a moment of weakness, something we would both look back on and regret. But no matter how much I tried to push it away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The pull was still there, hovering in the back of my mind, creeping into every quiet moment, every glance. We were both walking on eggshells now. The conversation that needed to happen never seemed to come. Neither of us had the courage to address it head-on. Instead, we fell into a routine, a delicate dance of avoiding the obvious while trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. But I could feel it. Every time our paths crossed, every time I caught his eyes lingering on mine, that same tension was there, thickening the air around us. That night, as I sat by the window, looking out at the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement, I thought about everything. How had it come to this? How had we let it get this far? It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what we hadn't said, the things that had gone unspoken, the emotions that had been left unchecked. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of the consequences as much as I was afraid of facing the truth. The truth was that what had happened between us was impossible to ignore, and the truth was also that we had to deal with it sooner or later. I heard him step into the room behind me, and for a moment, Everything seemed to freeze. Neither of us said anything. But I knew he was thinking about the same thing. I could feel it in the way the room seemed to shrink, the way the silence wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. He spoke first. "I can't stop thinking about it, you know." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. "I don't know what to do with all of this." I turned to face him, our eyes locking for the first time in what felt like forever. The vulnerability in his gaze made my heart ache. "Neither do I whispered. "But we can't pretend this didn't happen. We can't ignore it." He stepped closer, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "What happens now? What are we supposed to do?" I let out a breath, feeling the weight of everything. "We have to face it, whatever it is. We have to deal with what we've done and figure out what comes next." I looked at him, meeting his gaze with all the honesty I could muster. "But I think we both know that we can't go back. Whatever this is now, it's real." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with everything we hadn't said, all the feelings we hadn't acknowledged. And yet, despite the heaviness of it all, there was something almost peaceful about the moment, a strange sense of clarity. I felt like we were finally seeing each other as we really were. No more pretenses, no more lies. He took a step closer, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I allowed myself to just breathe, to just be in that moment with him. We had crossed a line, but we weren't backing away from it anymore. "I'm scared," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," I replied softly. "I am too." There was no easy answer, no simple way forward. But as we stood there, not saying anything more, I felt a strange sense of understanding between us. It was as if we had both come to terms with the fact that our lives had shifted, irrevocably, beyond repair. And then, just like that, the room felt a little bit lighter. The tension wasn't gone, not entirely, but we had reached some kind of unspoken agreement. We had taken the first step, facing the truth, facing the consequences. And no matter how hard it would be, that was the beginning of finding a way forward. The rain had started again, soft at first, but growing stronger. Outside, the world kept turning. But inside, we were left with only one question. What now?